While many of the Marvel heroes are unquestionably the good guys, Daredevil was a dark horse, an anti-hero that works in the gray areas of good and bad. The character of Daredevil was created in the 1960s for Marvel Comics by Stan Lee and Bill Everett, with some additional input from comics legend Jack Kirby. His first appearance was Daredevil #1 in April of 1964. Daredevil was about Matt Murdock. As a young man, he rescues someone from being hit by a truck, only to be accidentally blinded by a toxic chemical that sprays from the truck. While he's now blind, the chemical's given him the ability to see as sort of a radar sense, like a bat. Beyond that, his loss of sight exponentially increased his other senses. His father is ex-prize fighter Battling Jack Murdock. He wants Matt to grow up to be smart and strong so he won't end up like him. As he gets older, he goes to college to become an attorney to fight injustice in the courtroom. However, after years of dealing with the crime and corruption in his hometown of Hell's Kitchen, he becomes the masked vigilante, Daredevil, the man without fear. Lee loved the idea of a tragic superhero. The concept of him being a blind vigilante was rumored to be inspired by blind justice. For the first 6 issues, Daredevil's costume was yellow and black. However, in issue 7, it was changed to a deep red, which has been the character's signature suit ever since, although there have been some alternate costumes over the years. Over the course of 150 issues, Daredevil passed through different artists and writers, but it was never really a hit. On issue 151, Roger McKenzie took over the series. He was a writer who previously worked in horror comics like Creepy and Eerie, so he brought more horror elements to the character and gave the series a darker edge. Meanwhile, artist and writer Frank Miller was working on Spider-Man. In Spectacular Spider-Man issues 27 and 28, he introduced Daredevil as a guest star as a way to drum up interest in the character. Not too long after that, on issue 158 of Daredevil, Miller was placed on the comic to handle the art. It was now 1979, roughly 15 years after the creation of the character. Up to this point, Daredevil's sales were so poor, it was changed to a bi-monthly book. Editor Dennis O'Neil and Frank Miller didn't like Mackenzie's scripts. O'Neil had Mackenzie move to another book so Miller could take over. As a way to save the series from cancellation, Miller was granted full permission to give the character a complete overhaul. He went on to ignore all previous continuity and essentially rebooted the character. Miller was intrigued by Daredevil, but felt he needed more depth, so he retooled both sides of the character, Matt Murdock and Daredevil. He also brought in a heavy religious angle by making the character a troubled Catholic, trying to balance his faith with his obsession for justice. Miller's first issue where he had complete control was Daredevil 168 in 1981. Miller took the character of Kingpin, who was previously a Spider-Man villain, and made him Daredevil's arch-nemesis. Up to this point, Kingpin was an almost comical villain, but when Miller took over, he turned him into one of the most feared bad guys in the Marvel Universe. Miller also created fan favorite Elektra, Daredevil's ex-girlfriend, who was also a ninja assassin. Now, instead of being another superhero book from Marvel, Daredevil was reinvented as a crime comic. It made the book stand out from all the others. Miller's work on the series immediately gained a huge amount of attention. Within 3 months after he took over, sales of the book skyrocketed, and Marvel switched it back to being delivered monthly. The changes completely rejuvenated interest in the character and saved the book from being canceled. Miller's run on Daredevil made him an industry megastar, which led to him helming other groundbreaking comics like The Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One, Sin City, Ronin, and 300. Moving ahead to the late 90s, after flooding the market with books, Marvel Comics was going bankrupt. At the time, comics in general weren't really taken seriously in the mainstream. Comic book fans were mostly mocked as basement-dwelling losers. Marvel was looking into taking some of their comics and adapting them to film. Over the years, there were some Marvel properties that made their way to either TV or film, with some being good and some being bad. The Daredevil license was out there, and writer Mark Steven Johnson wanted to be involved. Johnson had been working in Hollywood for years as a writer for films like the 2 Grumpy Old Men movies and the comedy Big Bully. He had a meeting with producer Gary Foster about Daredevil. Johnson said, "There's this property that's going to be available called Daredevil, and it's my dream to make this movie." He told him this was something he wanted to do since he was 12. Foster wasn't familiar with Daredevil, so Johnson left him with a bunch of comics to read. After reading the comics, Foster was very interested in making the movie. Although in 1997, 20th Century Fox beat them to the punch. Fox acquired the rights to Daredevil and began working on the movie, with Chris Columbus directing. However, the production stalled due to the studio thinking there was no audience for this kind of comic book movie. When it became clear the movie wasn't going to happen, Columbus left the production. Just a short time later, one film came along that changed everything about comic book movies. In 1998, Marvel, along with New Line Cinema, released the movie Blade, which ultimately saved the company from going out of business. If you want more on that story, watch my Exploring Blade video. Blade spent 9 weeks in the top 10 and made over $131 million at the box office. Even with Blade's success, Fox wasn't sure what to do with Daredevil, so they sat on it for a few years until the film rights lapsed back to Marvel. Even Disney tried to buy the rights, but the negotiations fell through. After that, the film rights passed from studio to studio until eventually winding up at Columbia. Johnson and Foster had a meeting with Columbia, and Johnson was hired to write the script. The script he delivered was a huge mix of 60s and 80s Daredevil. It was decidedly dark and more character-driven, which was very unlike the other comic book movies that were in full swing now. Columbia ultimately decided to drop the project, and the property went back on the market. New Regency ended up acquiring the rights in 2000 with, oddly enough, 20th Century Fox as the distributor. After the major success of The X-Men in 2000, which was produced and distributed by Fox, they now saw the value in taking on a comic book movie. Johnson was rehired to write the script. He wrote the screenplay with the intention of it being a dark tale of a vigilante finding redemption. Johnson also wanted to show more of the human side of Daredevil, so he focused on scenes of him being a lawyer and not just a vigilante. While the studio was searching for a director, Johnson threw his hat in the ring. Foster and Johnson had a meeting with Avi Arad, the chief creative CEO at Marvel, to convince him that he was the right guy to direct. Johnson did have some experience directing. His first movie was Simon Birch back in 1998. However, the studio was skeptical because all of his previous work was comedy dramas. Johnson convinced the studio that because of the character-driven elements in the screenplay, he'd be perfect to direct. And they agreed. What the director wanted the most out of the film was to balance out the characters and the action. He wanted to have more story than your average action movie. Arad appreciated how Johnson's script truly captured the essence of Daredevil. He said, "Unlike so many of our characters, Daredevil must cope with something that nature has dealt him. He's a regular man with heart who's trying to do the right thing while dealing with his handicap." After looking at the script, the studio settled on a $40 million budget. While that was a large amount of money, they had to cut out some scenes because they wouldn't have been able to do them and still stay on budget. Although this was something that would change later. With the director and the script in place, they started casting. At the time, Ben Affleck's star was majorly on the rise. He was in the massive blockbuster Armageddon, the Oscar-winning Shakespeare in Love. He won an Oscar alongside of his friend Matt Damon for Good Will Hunting. And he just finished the Jack Ryan reboot, The Sum of All Fears. Affleck auditioned because Daredevil was one of his favorite comic books to read as a kid. Affleck was excited because he saw that there'd be more depth to the character, and it wasn't going to be just an action movie. Irish actor Colin Farrell was originally trying out for the role of Daredevil. The studio had Affleck in mind for the villain Bullseye. After seeing their casting sessions, they decided to have Farrell play Bullseye and Affleck play Daredevil. Jennifer Garner was cast to play Elektra. Garner had two major things going for her. First was that at the time, she was the lead on the J.J. Abrams action crime show Alias. So she was already in shape and could handle performing a stunt-heavy role. The second was that she had a background in ballet, which would make it easier for her to learn many of Elektra's acrobatics. Jon Favreau was hired to play Franklin Foggy Nelson, Matt Murdock's law partner and friend. David Keith was hired to play Matt's father, Jack. The multi-talented Joe Pantoliano came on board as the reporter Ben Urich. Casting the part for the massive villain Kingpin proved to be the most difficult. Because of the size of the actor they needed, they auditioned numerous wrestlers, since they were about the right size. They found a few who looked the part, but unfortunately, they couldn't act. One guy Johnson kept in mind was the 6'5", 300-pound actor Michael Clark Duncan. After seeing him, he knew he was the right choice for the character, even though Kingpin in the comics was white. He made the decision that the best actor for the job was more important than his skin color. So Michael Clark Duncan was hired, although at 305 pounds, he was still a bit too small. Johnson asked him to pack on another 30 pounds to bulk up for the role. Duncan begrudgingly accepted and ate constantly to pack on the calories while exercising for the next few months. So now they had this giant, almost 350-pound actor who was solid as a rock. He was so much like the character from the comics, no one would be laughing at him. Well, except for maybe Spider-Man. While casting was going along, production was well underway. Sets were being built, the effects were being designed, and Affleck and Garner were off training. Around this time, Johnson ran into his first major roadblock with the movie: the Daredevil costume. The studio wanted realism, so they pushed for Daredevil to be a vigilante with no costume. Johnson wanted to stay as close to the comics as possible, and there was no way to do this without him having a costume. They hired costume designer James Acheson to design the suit. Just before this, he designed the Spider-Man costume for the 2002 Sam Raimi film. The costume department spent 8 months on the design, and after numerous redesigns, Johnson and the studio finally agreed on a costume that was faithful to Daredevil's design, right down to the embroidered DD. Affleck had a body cast taken, and the suit was designed specifically for him. On another front, they wanted the movie to be accurate to the character's handicap. They worked with Tom Sullivan, who was blind, as their sight consultant. He helped them shape the day-to-day design of Matt Murdock. Things that blind people go through that your average person doesn't know. For example, when he's getting his money, he folds different denominations in various ways so he knows the amount of money he's handing out. Another thing was the opening of the film. It shows the lights in New York disappearing and spelling out the cast's name in Braille. That was the first thing Johnson wrote down when he did the screenplay. All the Braille is accurate. They ran into trouble when it came to the costume for the villain Bullseye. In the comics, he has a white and blue suit. This was one of those occasions where something looks fine on the page, but would look ridiculous in reality. While the studio conceded on the Daredevil costume, they pushed for the villain to not have one. After trying a few different designs, they opted for him to wear street clothes and have a bullseye branded on his forehead, which admittedly also looks silly. Marvel Entertainment CEO Avi Arad worked with Rich Thorne, the VP of production at Fox, to discuss the effects they'd need to bring the character to the big screen. The studio wanted to create digital doubles as a way to show Daredevil traveling through the rooftops of the city. After Spider-Man, which used a digital double for the character, they didn't want to do that with Daredevil. Johnson made the argument that Daredevil shouldn't be in any situation that a strong, gutsy man couldn't handle. Remember, Daredevil has heightened senses, but isn't superhuman like Spider-Man. So they wanted his actions to be plausible. For example, if he lands on the ground, he'd take it hard, while Spider-Man could take it gracefully. They wanted to create a hero that, unlike many other comic book heroes, could clearly experience pain. Thorne joined the production as the visual effects supervisor and second unit director. They knew there'd still be a need for some digital effects, so they hired the studio Rhythm and Hues to create New York environments, as well as some digital character animations. This was expanded to include the company's Pixel Magic, Digital Domain, and Cinesite. During the shoot, there were butting heads over the practical effects versus the digital. They were deciding which shots should be which. This meant deciding when it was appropriate to spend less money shooting physically and more money digitally. Thorne said, "When you have to put together a $300,000 or $400,000 shoot to avoid a $60,000 digital effect, it doesn't make sense." They planned to have many of the fights using stunt doubles on wires, but agreed to have digital doubles for the stunts that would be too risky to do practically. After many months of pre-production, they finally moved ahead to film. Filming started on March 25th, 2002. The movie was originally going to shoot in Vancouver, Canada, but they had to switch to LA because of the Canadian actors' strike. They filmed some plates in New York for establishing shots, but most of the film would be shot in LA. Although filming in LA wasn't going to be easy. There was a segment they shot in the back alleys of LA. The buildings around them were abandoned and filled with crackheads and squatters. They had to put netting above them because the inhabitants were throwing bottles, needles, and actual shit down on the cast and crew. Daredevil's home was called Hell's Kitchen. Hell's Kitchen was a neighborhood located in the west side of Manhattan. Since the 1800s, it became a location inhabited by poor and working-class Irish Americans. The origin of the name seems to have come from a statement by Davy Crockett in 1835. He said, "In my part of the country, when you meet an Irishman, you'll find a first-rate gentleman, but these are worse than savages. They're too mean to swab Hell's Kitchen." He was referring to 5 Points, another notorious slum in Manhattan, although now Hell's Kitchen is known as Clinton or Midtown West. The locals still prefer calling it Hell's Kitchen. Production designer Barry Chusid designed the rooftop sets, which were built on the Fox backlot. Rhythm and Hughes created digital matte backgrounds for the rooftop shots, and added water towers in digitally to make it look like New York. They did a full cyber scan of Ben Affleck to use as the character model. However, they still needed to make some changes at various points. There were times when the director said, "I know it's Ben's legs, but can we make them beefier?" Which they were able to do for certain shots. They wanted to be able to make it a little bit more comic book when it was needed. So there were plenty of scenes when it would go back and forth between the real actor and the digital one. The Rhythm and Hughes team discovered that Daredevil's outfit helped them to avoid the CG curse. Daredevil's costume was full of bumps and wrinkles. They said it was very difficult to make smooth things look real in CG, because they ended up looking fake. If Daredevil's costume looked too smooth in a shot, they'd added more wrinkles and bumps. Affleck wore colored contacts to make him look blind. The contacts were so thick, they made it impossible to see through. So for the scenes where he's wearing them, he's actually blind. Because of his super sensitive hearing, Matt sleeps in a sensory deprivation tank as the only way to shut off the outside world. Daredevil's special ability was that he could see the world around him using echolocation like a bat. The effects team needed to come up with a way to show this on film. The original comic depicted Daredevil's radar vision to be wavy dotted lines with the word "beep." Johnson asked the visual effects team to come up with some concepts to make it work for film. What Rhythm and Hughes came up with they called the Shadow World, the visual representation of how Daredevil would see sounds. The concept came from simulating the look of electron microscopy, a technique used to obtain high-res images of biological and non-biological specimens. The end result was having imagery painted as the sound moved across the objects, like a cross between a sonogram and a three-dimensional radar. This was the result of over a year's worth of research. They said each Shadow World shot had somewhere between 10 to 15 elements, which they layered and then rendered in the computer. This was something that just made more sense to do digitally. The hardest effect to do was the scene with Elektra in the rain. The request was that the audience could see her face in the rain, looking like it was painting her skin with diamonds. They did this by making every raindrop act like a little light source when they hit her skin. The tools they used were previously developed for sequences in the Fellowship of the Ring and the Avalanche in XXX. They reused a variation of this later when Kingpin is covered in water from the sprinklers. Realizing that sound would also be incredibly important to these scenes, they worked with Skywalker Sound to design the noises that would play against the Shadow World segments. They hired Hong Kong fight director Cheng Yan-yun, who just before this worked on the Matrix sequels. They also hired Jeff Imada as the stunt coordinator and physical effects supervisor. Imada was the stunt coordinator on The Crow. Jen and Ben spent over 6 weeks working on the choreography for the Elektra Daredevil fight on the playground. The scene took 5 days to shoot. Affleck had 4 stunt doubles, 1 for weapons, 1 for hand-to-hand fighting, 1 for wire work, and 1 for gymnastics. He still did a portion of his own stunts, like the part where Kingpin throws him into a window. Matt's father was an alcoholic prizefighter. In the comics, he's battling Jack Murdock. But for the movie, they changed it to Jack the Devil Murdock. In the beginning, he's a goon for the crime boss Fallon, but Matt convinces him to stop drinking and reclaim his title. The makeup effects team did their best with David Keith to make him look like Jack Murdock from the comics. They raised his brow, broke his nose, and gave him cauliflower ears. The director loves motorcycles, so he put in plenty of scenes with them. Colin Farrell did the stunt where he stands on the motorcycle. It was on a trailer, and the actor was connected to a support arm to keep him from falling and getting hurt. They later painted the arm out with CG. In the scene, Daredevil hits Bullseye and knocks him off the bike. However, the shots they had never looked right, so they went in and did them digitally. The cathedral at the end was based on St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. The battle was the biggest set piece of the whole movie, with the two climbing a 200-foot church pipe organ and fighting on it. They choreographed the whole thing with the actors, but it was proving too difficult to do the whole thing practically. The actors did some of the moves, but a good deal of it was done digitally. Many of the scenes with Affleck and Favreau were improvised. In the coffee shop, they wanted to showcase Matt and Foggy's relationship. There was a joke about Fight Club, which was still relatively new at the time.
But it's the first rule of Fight Club, don't talk about Fight Club. So you're not in the Fight Club, you're out of it.
I didn't see the movie. I'm sure it's a funny joke, but I didn't see it.
The studio didn't like this because they were referencing another movie within their movie, even though it was also a movie from Fox. Part of the way through filming, Spider-Man's released and is a monumental hit. It made over $825 million and was a shock to the industry. Seeing how comic book movies might be big money, the studio gave the production an additional $40 million. This ended up being both good and bad. Good, because it allowed them to expand the scope of the film beyond the initial budget. They were able to restore scenes from the original script because they could afford to do them now. For example, they didn't shoot scenes of young Matt being bullied because it wasn't seen as essential to the film. Now with the extra money, they were able to add them back in. This would make a huge difference in the quality of the film, since it increased the development of the character. The bad was that this put the film under more scrutiny. The executives were fairly hands-off the film when it was only $40 million. Now that it was double that, they put the film under the microscope. The executives started noticing all sorts of pointless, superficial things within the movie that they demanded to be changed. One of the biggest changes was something that they had already fought over back in pre-production. The studio demanded the director change the color of the costume to black because they were afraid that audiences would confuse Daredevil with Spider-Man because both costumes were red. At the time this happened, they were filming the big fight in the bar and had to make changes on the fly. They darkened the color of the suit, so in the bar fight, there's only a few moments where you can see that it's red. After more disagreements, the director eventually won out and was able to keep the original color of the costume. The director wanted to include as many things from the comics as possible into the movie. To start things off, there's the obligatory Stan Lee cameo. Early in the film, Jack's watching a fight with a guy named Colin. He's named after Gene Colan, who was a Daredevil artist in the 60s and 70s. Father Everett was named after Bill Everett, Daredevil's original artist. Jose Quesada was named after artist Joe Quesada. In 1998, when Marvel Comics had just filed for bankruptcy, they contracted Joe Quesada and his partners to produce a more mature line of comics called Marvel Knights. This included characters like Daredevil, the Punisher, and Black Panther. Just a few years after this, in 2000, Quesada became the new editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics. John Romita, the boxer Jack was supposed to lose to, was named after John Romita Jr. and Sr., both of whom worked on Daredevil. When Fallon spoke to Jack, he mentioned Miller, Mack, and Bendis.
Miller, Mack, Bendis, they're all my fighters.
He's referring to Frank Miller, David Mack, and Brian Michael Bendis, all of whom worked on Daredevil. Kevin Smith played the lab assistant Kirby, named after Jack Kirby. He's also in there because he wrote the story arc Guardian Devil, which is name-dropped at the end of the film.
A Guardian Devil.
He's also a good friend of Affleck, and he talks about his time in the film in one of his spoken word tour videos. When Daredevil's holding the cross in the beginning, this is an homage to the cover of Guardian Devil 3. The scene with Matt in the alley after his father was killed was taken directly from Daredevil, The Man Without Fear, in 1993. The way he's falling is an homage to the Marvel Knights cover of Daredevil #1. The scenes with nuns were referencing Daredevil's mother, Mother Maggie. She left her abusive relationship with Matt's father to become a nun in Hell's Kitchen, so she can still keep an eye on him. Frank Miller's the bad guy that Bullseye kills to steal his bike. Matt's able to find Elektra at the party because he can smell her by her perfume. This was taken right from issue 1. Elektra's red outfit was an homage to her classic costume. Daredevil can tell if a person's lying by their heartbeat. If they're wearing a pacemaker, it makes it impossible for Matt, which was another thing that was taken right out of the comics. The rooftop fight between Elektra and Bullseye was almost shot for shot as it was in the comics, right down to her getting her throat slit by a card and then impaled on her own sai. Because of the comics code at the time it was first published, they couldn't show Elektra being impaled, which is why the back of her costume is protruding out, which they mimicked in the movie. The scene where Daredevil's chasing Quesada was also taken from the comics. Only Daredevil was going after the Fixer, the man who killed his father. He corners him in a subway where he has a heart attack and dies. In the movie, Daredevil's chasing Quesada, who falls onto the subway tracks. The scene where Daredevil's doing backflips away from shards of glass was inspired by a Visa commercial with Zhang Ziyi. Matt gets a call from Heather Glenn, one of his girlfriends in the comics. She's voiced by Claudine Farrell, Colin's sister, who has a cameo in the bar scene. The scene towards the end of Bullseye in the hospital is taken from issue 181. Johnson was a huge fan of Alex Proyss's The Crow. He put the flaming Daredevil in there as an homage to the Flaming Crow. The girl who walks into the coffee shop at the end was Jennifer Garner's stunt double. Kane Hodder plays Fallon's bodyguard. The big lunk in the bar is The Rock's cousin and personal stunt double, Tenori Reed. After years of pre-production and months of shooting, the movie wrapped. Principal photography ended July 23rd, 2002. When they first started this, the effects department estimated there would be about 100 visual effects shots. By the end, there were over 400. Johnson put together his cut of the film, which was an R-rated, 133-minute action drama. Despite delivering exactly what he said when he got the job, the studio still insisted the film was far too long and demanded it be cut down to a lean 100 minutes or less. They said to get rid of big chunks of dialogue because it slowed the movie down, and shorten the fight scenes because they were too long. They insisted that it be a brisk superhero action film, but with less action? This was the new battle Johnson found himself in, the battle for the edit. Since Spider-Man was a massive hit and was PG-13, the studio saw this movie as something that could be made to appeal to teenagers. They just put $80 million into the film and didn't see getting that back with the stricter rating. They insisted it be trimmed from R to PG-13. The studio doubled down, saying to Johnson that even though they knew his cut was better, it was too intellectual for the average audience. Against the director's wishes, they butchered the film. They had it cut into something that it wasn't. The first thing they removed was an entire subplot with Coolio on trial for murder. This was originally to show more of Matt in the courtroom, but also to be a major plot point that I'll get into later. The new cut removed about a half hour from the film. With so much material cut, the film now didn't make sense, so now they had to do some reshoots to fill in the blanks created by the new edit. This led to them having to be cheap with the reshoots because they were running out of money. They reshot scenes of Matt in the confessional with Father Everett. This changed the dynamic because in the original cut, the father didn't know he was Daredevil. Now, in what would become the theatrical cut, he knows. The studio also demanded an addition the director hated. They wanted a love scene with Elektra. The director didn't like this because it brought too much happiness to Matt. He wanted to keep him lonely the entire film. The studio wanted them to restructure the film to focus more on Matt and Elektra's relationship. They shot some additional scenes of them dating. This was a way to appeal to the teen demographic they were trying to court, who would be seeing this movie on dates. So the studio removed action and character development to shove in an unnecessary romance. With the original cut, Johnson wanted to show that Daredevil was slipping into the dark side after years of being a vigilante. He was a loner who was living a painful life. While filming, Matt Murdock was always kept partially in darkness. However, after meeting Elektra, they start to light his face more as a way to show his life getting better. By adding in the love scene, it undercut the duality of the film. Early on, when Matt's with Elektra, he hears a crime being committed and tries to take off. She asks him to stay, but he opts to go, leaving her alone. Later at Elektra's father's funeral, Matt tries to get her to stay because he doesn't want her to become like him. This all changed with the new edit. By him staying and them having sex, the funeral scene has way less impact. In the theatrical cut, when Matt and Elektra fight in the playground, they cut it short.
My name's Electra Nachos.
In the director's cut, after the fight's over, they talk for a few minutes before she says this and leaves.
How am I gonna find you?
You won't. I'll find you.
In the director's cut, he doesn't see her again until later.
Told you I'd find you.
In the theatrical cut, they immediately go on a date shortly after the playground scene. So later when she says,
Told you I'd find you.
it doesn't make sense. While it was risky to have Quesada die in the beginning, Johnson went with it because it was needed for the hero's journey. He lets him die and doesn't realize until later how far down the dark path he had gone. By the end of the film, when he faces off against Kingpin, he lets him live because he learned mercy. In the brief time he spent with Elektra, he saw how quickly a good person's life could be destroyed in the quest for revenge. So he lets Kingpin live because he knows he's going to jail. Speaking of which, let's go back to the courtroom subplot they removed. Matt took the Dante Jackson case because he knew he was innocent. While investigating, they discovered a message that was left by the girl who was murdered. This was another homage to the comics. In Daredevil Spider-Man #1, Matt receives a message of 7MO, which was meant to be read upside down, letting him know he needed to search for the owl. In the movie, it's MOM, which when read upside down is WOW. This was the acronym of Wesley Owen Welch, Kingpin's assistant. He gives this info to the cops, which leads them to Welch, and eventually Kingpin's downfall. Jackson's found innocent, and the police bring down Kingpin's empire, all because of this seemingly unrelated court case. So, in the end of the film, it makes sense when Daredevil says,
Sirens, they're coming for you.
For me. Did you hear? The word's out on the Kingpin.
because he knows the police are coming to arrest him. In the theatrical cut, it makes no sense because without the Dante Jackson subplot, the police have no reason to arrest Kingpin. They just decide to arrest him simply because the movie needed them to. The new cut of the film was now 103 minutes. The film was released on February 14th, 2003, with a record-breaking $40 million on opening weekend. Audiences enjoyed the film, but critics called it shallow. The biggest complaints seemed to be that there was no story. The movie did well, but it wasn't pulling in X-Men or Spider-Man numbers. By the end of its run, it managed to pull in $179 million worldwide. A few months later, the movie was released on DVD as the standard theatrical cut. Then, roughly a year later, something wonderful happened. Thanks to the wave of successful films based on Marvel's comic properties, they were able to get out of bankruptcy. Avi Arad requested the studio release the full director's cut of the film. He didn't have the leverage when the film was in production, but now that Marvel was on better footing, he was able to push for the film to get an official director's cut. So on November 30th, 2004, the director's cut of Daredevil was released on DVD. This was the first time audiences were able to see the film the way it should have been released. Daredevil's story is much more detailed, Kingpin is way more menacing, and the inclusion of the courtroom subplot fleshes out the story immensely. They got rid of the superfluous stuff, like the love scene, and now the movie felt the way it was always supposed to. They adjusted the fight scenes to their proper length, and added attention back to those scenes, especially the final showdown against Kingpin. The director wanted to show that being a superhero isn't always such a great thing. You try to do good, but it's often perceived as bad. The people you care about are constantly put in danger, and your life can end up a lonely, haunted, painful experience. On the flip side, he showed how one person can make a difference, how good can triumph over evil, and how a seemingly unrelated act of kindness can have a huge impact in ways you would never expect. The movie did have a few things happen in its wake. The echolocation look created for the movie was used in the game Perception. The movie did introduce a lot of people to Evanescence, who are featured heavily in the soundtrack, as well as the ad campaign, with their hit song and future meme, Bring Me to Life. Ben Affleck met Jennifer Garner on the movie, they started dating, and later were married. While the movie wasn't a major hit, it was still a hit. This led to Jennifer Garner doing the spin-off Elektra, which didn't go over very well. Affleck had a cameo that was supposed to lead into another Daredevil movie, but that didn't happen, possibly due to Elektra running into more problems while filming than Daredevil did. They removed large chunks from the Elektra film, including scenes with Stick, played by Terrence Stamp, but that's a story for another day. After Elektra bombing at the box office, Affleck stated he wasn't interested in playing a superhero again. The suit was way too uncomfortable, and the stunt work was grueling. However, he changed his mind when they offered him the role of Batman in Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. There was a rumor that while working on the film, Jon Favreau was able to talk to some of the Marvel executives, which led to him directing Iron Man in 2008. This was the movie that started what would become the billion-dollar MCU. Over a decade later, Netflix partnered with Marvel to make the Daredevil TV series. They weren't hindered by an out-of-touch studio or ratings, so they were able to make the show as good as it could be. Now Daredevil has moved off of Netflix and onto Disney+, with largely the same cast. I don't trust Disney with how poorly they've treated some of their properties in recent years, but I do trust Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, who are the new Daredevil showrunners. The duo have created some of the best, most thought-provoking movies in the past 10 years. So I wish them all the best, and hope they can retain control over the property, because if so, the series is in good hands. There are a lot of movies out there where the public may never see the real version. Thankfully, Daredevil is not one of them. The director's cut takes an okay comic book movie and elevates it to one of the most complete comic book movies of the time. If you've only seen the theatrical cut, I implore you to watch the director's cut. It's a completely different movie. The studio majorly screwed up by trying to force the film into being something that it's not, which has happened more than a few times. This isn't even the first time the studio screwed up an Affleck film. My only complaint in the film is that Bullseye looks silly. Everything else is terrific. I think it would have been better to just put the bullseye on his hat instead of branding his forehead. 2 years ago, on the 20th anniversary of the film, Mark Steven Johnson said, "Looking back on it, one of the mistakes I made with the film was wanting to put everything in. I wanted to do Daredevil's origin story, and I wanted to do the Elektra saga, and I wanted to introduce Bullseye and Foggy. I wanted everything to be in there, but the film could only support so much. And then when you're told to cut a half hour out of it to make it more of a love story, things start to feel rushed and not quite right. It's a fan thing. When you love something so much, you want to tell it all. Even though the director's cut is the movie that should have been released in the theaters, I applaud Marvel for at least letting them release it on DVD. It seemed Fox was the ones who wanted the film neutered. Johnson did a terrific job with the film, and I'm glad that audiences can see his vision and not the studio's vision. Daredevil is a very grim character. It's not dark for the sake of being dark. It's an essential part of the character. Foggy's there for some comedic relief, but the movie was never intended to be a lighthearted hero tale mixed with a love story. They try to remove that edge and make it appeal to the wrong audience. When a studio tries to brighten up a dark property, you don't get box office gold. You get Blade 3. Hold on a moment. I just want to talk to you a little bit more about the episode before you go. I first did this video almost 10 years ago when I was freelancing for the website The Escapist. Unfortunately, due to some copyright nonsense, only a handful of you saw the original version on YouTube, so I wanted to revisit it on the 10-year anniversary. Although I'm glad that most of you missed the other one, because this version is much more complete. I was still figuring things out back then. The audio wasn't as good, and it was only about 16 minutes long. So this version, much like the director's cut of the movie Daredevil, is the complete version. This also coincides with me doing GoodBadFlicks full-time for 10 years. So thank you for your support, and here's to another 10 years. With that out of the way, back to the outro.
nuts! Oh!
All right, bring in Daredevil number